So this is being recorded. I see Matthew Keenan has lowered his hand. I never get a message when someone raises their hand. I seem to only get messages when they lower their hand.
Hello, sir. Can you
Okay,
hear
so
me?
now I saw something,
Hello?
and I'm trying to figure out how to.
Sorry, can you hear me, sir? Hello?
So, Brenda, with your permission, I'll turn to your answer in a minute. I want to give Matthew the chance if he was trying to say something. Oh, I see. I didn't have my speaker on. My speaker's on now. Matthew, I'm sorry about that. Could you say it again if you were speaking?
Oh, no worries, no worries. I was just worried my mic wasn't working. I was just
No.
saying,
Yeah.
I'm wondering if he's going to be beneficial for Canada at all. Um, I know under the previous administration we had some tariffs and everything. Uh, Also, I'm wondering like political backlash from parties here when it comes to things like the pipeline. So I know a lot of us have been trying to get that built for a few years, and we sort of people have been throwing blame at the current prime minister. So I'm wondering if what's going to happen here, like if he's going to be of any benefit to us. But other than that, I don't really care about American politics. I just want to know if he's going to be useful to us at all.
Right. So I'm glad that you put it that way. The first thing I want to call to your attention is a methodological, an initial methodological distinction between the objective and the subjective sense of caring. And Matthew helpfully brought up both sides of that. The first part of what Matthew said, I'm going to summarize what I remember you said, Matthew. And if I get any part wrong, please correct me. It'll be super helpful for what I'm trying to do. So Matthew said that on the pipeline component of Biden taking office as the 46th president, there will be consequences for Canada. Matthew framed it, I think, as he said, there'll be consequences for Canada if the pipeline doesn't go through. One of the consequences of Canada for the pipeline is that the corporations that I'm only going to identify them one at a time. I'm not, among other things, I'm not aware of all of the consequences. I don't believe anyone is aware of all of the consequences, since those consequences are in the future. And in my view, nobody knows, nobody can tell the future ahead of time. But in the present, we see that TransCanada Energy suspends work on the Keystone Pipeline. Now, what that means is that in Alberta, a bunch of people are not going to go to work today who otherwise would have gone to work. And presumably in the days leading up, in the last few days since the Biden team announced that they were going to be rescinding the U.S. presidential renewal that allowed the Keystone Pipeline to go ahead, Keystone is going to lay a bunch of workers off, and the Premier of Alberta, Jason Kenney, articulated a real concern that many jobs will be lost, actually, is what I think he said, if Keystone does not go forward. Another broader consequence is there's some chance that the price of gasoline, at least in the short term, will go up. And so that each of us who drives a car will have to pay more money. More broadly, it's not just those of us who own cars who have an economic stake in what the price of gasoline is. Any one of us who buys anything in a store, maybe not quite any one of us and maybe not quite anything, but most of us who buy stuff in stores can expect that everything else remaining the same, if the price of gasoline goes up, that increased price will be passed on to consumers. So these are all objective reasons that connect the policies that Joe Biden has announced he will pursue as president of the United States to our everyday lives. Objective reasons in the sense that the cost of bread will go up, let's just say, to make it more or less metaphorical, but a metaphor that I think ties quite closely to what most analysts believe is one possible way that the suspension of the Keystone pipeline will have on Canadians. And therefore, one reason why Canadians might have a vested interest, one way or the other, in Joe Biden becoming president. Now, Brenda, I'm inviting you, but not, of course, require. No, I don't know if it's a matter of course or not, but if I'd be interested, Brenda, if you would be willing to turn on your microphone to maybe explain what you mean when you say hopefully they stop invading Indigenous territory for that pipeline.
If he does not go through with that promise to stop it, I hope at least they have better planning so that they don't continue to invade unceded territory. That's all.
Right. So I want to take a sort of a procedural step back before I continue trying to articulate the connection between current events and sociological theorizing. My experience first as a student, which is a pretty long experience, and my experience as a professor, which is a longer experience. There's sort of two kinds of professors. Most professors I've had and most professors I know are pretty good at keeping their own opinions to themselves. I'm not one of those professors, though. And there are for sure advantages to doing that. And I've tried so far today successfully, but that ends right now. It will become clear as we move along that I have positions, sometimes strong positions on issues, controversial issues. So the short version of this is I'm super sympathetic to the position it seems to me that Brenda is articulating when she responds the way she responds to how are we affected in Canada by the US president's decision or announcement of the decision to rescind the Keystone permits to extend the pipeline. And so Brenda, who I don't know, and Brenda knows that I don't know her, and so the rest of you will have to take my word for it. Brenda's articulating concern for the indigenous territory, and maybe you could explain a little bit, Brenda. It's possible that not everybody else who's listening understands the connection between the Keystone Pipeline and indigenous territorial rights.
I actually feel like the problem is most politicians don't even really understand what it means to go through these reserves, go through this unceded territory. This land is not Canadian land, it's not American land. So when they build these pipelines through Indigenous land, they're invading foreign nations, and nobody seems to really understand that. I don't have faith that they're not going to build this pipeline. There are other pipelines also being built. I just think better planning, they can avoid all of this if they just, maybe take the long way around.
Okay, excellent. So there's a lot to unpack there, and I want to do my best to keep my eye on the ball from the point of view of connecting these events to sociological theorizing. But one of the reasons that theory is necessary in sociology, ongoing theorizing is necessary in sociology, is because our everyday understandings often fail to allow it, our everyday knowledge of the world, including theoretical knowledge of the world, often fails to explain properly to us what we're experiencing. And so Brenda described more accurately than I did when I asked her to explain why she wrote what she wrote. A key feature of what Brenda said is that the land through which this pipeline is supposed to go, it has been promised to go. So, I mean, a lot of money's been spent on this already, is unceded land. Now, the nature of that, what that means is that it is land, the title to which, and there's some amount of controversy about exactly where these boundaries are, but there's no controversy about the following. The US government and the Canadian government have both separately acknowledged that there are large areas in Canada and in the United States that the US government and the Canadian government have never legitimately claimed as their own land, and both the US government and the Canadian government have acknowledged and not lived up to the acknowledgement that having entered into treaties with the native peoples who were on that land when Canada and the United States completed their invasion of the North American landmass, those treaties persist and continue to persist with the internationally binding quality that all the other international agreements that Canada and the United States have entered into with other countries, treaties on the basis that the treaties that the US and the Canadian government absolutely depend on, and that they acknowledge and agree that they depend on, so that the legal standing of the uncededness of this land is, from a legal point of view, 100% clear. The problem with international law is, and some international lawyers joke about this, the problem with international law is that there's no such thing. The problem is that because there's no effective highest legal instance to which nations effectively belong, international law is only as effective as the willingness of the parties to those laws to follow those guidelines. So a notorious example of this is in the 1980s, the United States was found by the International Criminal Court to have illegally placed mines in the port of Managua in Nicaragua for the purpose of overturning the government in Nicaragua. And so what the US government did is they initially participated in that trial, but when it became clear they were going to lose the trial, they were going to be convicted of an international crime in the international court, they just pulled out of the agreement. And so Canada is rolled forward to 2021. Canada makes a big public show, and the United States, in slightly different ways, but largely with the same effect, makes a big show internationally about being in favor. When Justin Trudeau was first elected, one of the promises that he made was promises to the native peoples in Canada to live up to the commitments of the treaties that Canada already has with those peoples, and Trudeau has not succeeded in doing that. Now, how hard he tried and all that, these are all difficult things, but the sociologically complex part of this, the part that requires theorizing, is how come laws work in some ways but don't work in other ways that don't seem that different. And so what we're going to take a look at in a minute or two is the different, in very general terms, the different theoretical perspectives that have been developed by sociologists and people thinking about sociology to try to explain those things. Okay, so if anybody else has something they want to add to this, these two ways of looking at the Keystone Pipeline, I'd be very keen to hear from you. You can type it or just turn your mic on if you want. If you don't, there's a one third issue I'm going to raise.
Oh,
Go ahead, Matthew. No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that I'm a bit concerned about like Alberta and like the provinces out there feeling disconnected from the rest of the country and not really feeling, I guess, Canadian at this point. They feel more Albertan or Western. So I find that to be concerning, and I don't think we should antagonize them.
Okay, so that's an important point. I want to raise a third issue before I come back to Matthew's point, because Matthew's point, maybe not by coincidence, captures exactly the topic that I want to use to move to the theory thing. The third area of concern around the canceling of the Keystone Pipeline, and the reason that Biden and his supporters have put the main reason that Biden and his supporters have put forward for canceling the Keystone Pipeline is concern around climate change and the issue, the fact that global temperature is rising at a rate that's unsustainable in the short run, never mind the medium and the long run. If the temperature on our planet continues to rise at the rate that it's currently rising, human life eventually is going to be unsustainable. But well before human life becomes unsustainable, there will be, and there already are, immediate consequences that are life-changing for, and destroying for people. Among other issues, the level of the ocean on some parts of the planet are rising to the degree that there are some countries that will be underwater in the next few years. Vanuatu in the Pacific Ocean may soon become uninhabitable, and so. And there might be some people in Canada who have relatives who are from Vanuatu, and so they would have a kind of personal connection to it. And there are plenty of people in Canada, and hopefully all of the people listening right now care about the lives of other people. Okay, so there are what I had expected, and I'm glad Brenda brought up the point she brought up, but what I expect, the two concerns that I expected were sort of pro-pipeline and anti-pipeline based on either economy or environment. Brenda raises a third perspective to this, and all of these different perspectives that are partly competing, partly overlapping, partly mutually reinforcing, describe the background condition in which, on the one hand, we live, and on the other hand, in which sociological thinking and sociological research operates. Okay, so now when Matthew came back, what he said was he's concerned that the people in Alberta are feeling abandoned. I don't want to put words in your mouth, Matthew. So once again, I'm going to hopefully reformulate what I think is the claim you're making. If the federal government doesn't successfully support the Alberta provincial position on the very, very strong importance, maybe even the necessity of completing the Keystone Pipeline. Actually, I think I've made an assumption that is ungrounded. What is maybe Matthew, you can help us out. What is the Keystone Pipeline? I shouldn't have just jumped to the assumption that everyone knows what the Keystone
pipeline
is. Yeah.
Okay, well, for those who don't know, or for those who are from out of the country, it's
right.
a project that is trying to connect Alberta, like oil from the province of Alberta, which is an
Yeah.
inland province in the west. So that way it's easier to sell oil overseas. It's very controversial here. It's a big issue, but that's the general gist of it. It's just trying to connect oil.
Could you explain? Sorry, Matthew. Could you explain a little bit? So you went most of the way. Alberta doesn't have direct access to the ocean, and it's on the ocean that much of this oil gets transported around the world. So the pipeline would go from Alberta through the continental United States, ultimately down to New Orleans, where New Orleans is an enormous port city, or I mean, it's a regular sized city with an enormous port, and shipping containers, oil tankers, would be taking the crude oil, the crude and the refined oil that would be transported from Alberta into the United States, refined in the United States, and then sold around the world. And it would lower the cost and therefore increase the amount of profit that that oil could be sold for. Is that about your understanding of it, Matthew?
Yeah, that's exactly what they're planning. I think it might be to Texas, not New Orleans, though, but I can't remember.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, right. Oh, I see. Yeah, but right. The main point is, yeah, among many other things, I'm not an expert in economics and I'm not an expert in engineering. I'm an expert in the philosophy of social science. But in any event, that's the shape of it. The Keystone project is a project to build a pipeline to take oil from Alberta into the United States and through the United States out into the rest of the world to be able to sell oil and to make a return on that sale. And so the consequences of not building that pipeline are in the first instance, the immediate consequences are economic. So there's that. Now, the role of energy in the economic role of energy in Alberta is enormous. Oil is by far the dominant factor in the Alberta economy. And in fact, it's arguably the dominant factor in the total Canadian economy. Alberta will be hit hardest probably, but so will the rest of Canada if let's say if the oil sector is negatively impacted by this decision. This is broadly accepted by almost everybody who has a stake in this and who has an opinion on this. The sociological question, the sociological question that has to be addressed, or the question that has to be addressed by us as citizens, and also the sociological question is, how are those disadvantages going to be distributed across Canadian society and also around the world? So Matthew mentions that in Alberta, Albertans, let's say many Albertans, at the very least some Albertans, but I think many Albertans, have a lot of trouble believing that the Canadian government would ever pick Alberta over Ontario. I think that's the broad view of Alberta. Does that sound right to you, Matthew, or anybody else?
It does to me. I think that sentiment's pretty high out there, sadly.
When push comes to shove, Albertans don't trust the Canadian federal government more when it's a liberal government than when it's a conservative government. And that's partly because the liberal governments have almost always been led by and have more seats representing people in Ontario and Quebec. And so Alberta has for many, many, many years, ever since Alberta, actually, in fact, even before Alberta got into the oil business, but the oil business has driven this in many ways. Albertans feel that the federal government has put the interests of Ontario and Quebec ahead of the interests of Alberta for a long, long time. And part of what makes that even worse from the Alberta point of view is that the Canadian economy in general, but also the revenues to the federal government have been derived to a great extent from that very same commodity, oil. And one of the consequences, and the way Matthew put it, I think it turns out to be very helpful for the point I'm trying to make, is that the feelings of the people of Alberta is that they don't belong in Canada, that Canada doesn't see them as part of us, and therefore they see themselves more as Albertans than they do as Canadians. Is that close to what you were saying, Matthew?
Yeah, and I'd also add that for just people who aren't from Canada, there isn't really a strong Canadian identity here. I find that people tend to identify themselves more with like being from Newfoundland or being from Alberta, or a lot of the time it's just I'm Chinese. It's not a strong identity, as in many places. Like think of it as, I suppose, Italy right after unification. There's a quote I read that said, "We have made Italy, but we must make the Italians. We haven't made the Canadians. There's Canada, but no Canadians." So that's a simple way how I view it. So it's just making that problem even worse.
So I just want to be clear. You said here. Are you in Alberta right now? You don't need to tell me, actually.
Oh no, I'm Ontario.
You mean that Canadians everywhere, or at least that many Canadians, no matter where they are in Canada, identify more immediately in a local way rather than in a national way? Is that what you meant?
Yes. But also like in a national way, if they're like relatively new to the country, I still feel like a lot of people still identify with their previous national roots.
Right. So that's a tricky question to test. It's a widely shared perception, to be sure. And one of the ways to move from everyday opinion to sociological reflection is to test the proposition that you made. So you said most people, I think what you said was, most people feel that way. So you could, as a sociological work, what you would then do is you would transform that experience into a hypothesis, and the hypothesis would be something along the lines that most Canadians identify more with their local area than with the whole country, or some version of that. And the next claim you made, also interesting, also tailored perfectly for what I wanted to do this afternoon. You compared it to views that are held in other national jurisdictions, so that Italians feel more. Your claim was, I believe, that Italians feel more Italian than Canadians feel Canadian, and that's a testable claim. If money isn't an object, you could do a giant survey of Canadian people and a giant survey of Italian people, and then compare the results. I suspect. Well, anyway, never mind what I suspect. So. That is how sociology operates. That's one way that sociology operates. So now, if I've read this right, Hassan, is that the quote, a claim from you that people might say they are from Canada, but they never state they are Canadian? I'm not sure from the. Okay, so the main thing I wanted to do was make sure that I understand how this chat function works. So the name is above and what I see. So good. So I want to put a pin for a second in that, and I'm going to just do one quick little thing. I want to round out how complex this is. The story just below the canceling of the pipeline was in a way by a weird coincidence, but it says James Cross, British diplomat who survived FLQ kidnapping, dead at 99. There's another context in which Canadian unity, the feeling of Canadian unity is fractured, and that is the French-English dynamic. And I'm old enough, it turns out that I'm from Montreal, and that I'm a francophone. I go by Tony, but my name is Antoine. I went to French school, and when I was very young, I grew up in a French neighborhood, although my parents, we moved when I was about 10 to an Anglophone neighborhood in Montreal, but I grew up in a French neighborhood, went to French school. And I was alive when James Cross was kidnapped. I remember it very well for a bunch of different reasons. But in the 1960s in Quebec, many, many, many people, especially Francophone people, not only felt that they weren't part of Canada, they felt that the rest of Canada was trying to destroy them. And so one of the things that happened in the 1960s was that this feeling of alienation produced a bunch of different social responses. And one of those social responses was the formation of a political movement to take Quebec out of Canada so that Quebec could form its own country. And one of the most extreme manifestations of that separatist movement was the formation of the FLQ, the Front de Libération du Québec. And one of the cells, they organized themselves into cells, into small groups, in order to take actions that would force the Quebec government and the Canadian government to allow, this is their formulation of it, to allow for the people of Quebec to form their own, the country that they believed they either deserved or already were. There's a bunch of different ways that this worked. But so the FLQ kidnapped James Cross, who was a British trade representative, a British diplomat, and they held him hostage for a while, and eventually he was released. The FLQ, a different cell of the FLQ at the same time, also kidnapped Pierre Laporte, who was the Quebec Minister of Finance, and they killed him, and his body was found in the trunk of a car near a Canadian Army base on the south shore of the St. Lawrence River, right near Montreal. And so in Quebec, like in Alberta, Quebec and Alberta both share this feeling of alienation from what they see as the rest of the country, but that alienation is determined by different kinds of factors. So I just want to go back and I want to make sure. Right. So that's a good quote, and I'm impressed actually that you cited Italian unification, and the quote even that we have made Italy, now we must make Italians. The idea that national belonging is constructed, is made, is the result of effort, is an important way of recognizing the challenges of understanding that process, and in order to make Italians, what you had to do is stop them from being only Genoans or Calabrese or Sicilians and so on. So Italian unification was a complex political outcome of all kinds of power relations in Europe at the time, and Italy is formed into a country made up of subunits that did not have a national identity, nor did they have independence in their, not all of them had independence in their own right from the other European powers. And eventually, as a result of, and historians differ sometimes extremely in extremely strong ways around the nature of those dynamics, but Italy eventually is formed into a country, and the people who were responsible for that understood, and incidentally, it happened around the same time as Canada became a country. So what they had to do was they had to turn people who lived in what is now the country of Italy and make them see themselves and behave as though and be committed to a unified country that had just been created. And in Canada, it was the same thing. Well, I'm getting off track here. I'm going to switch over to my slides because I've already taken up, I hope you think productively, but I want to take a look at one slide in particular. So now, what is going on? I'll just be another second here. Okay. So there's a slide on your screen now. Okay, thank you. So for the rest of the semester, for the rest of this semester and next semester in sociology, we will be trying to understand how sociologists have come to approach all kinds of different social phenomena that they believe, I think almost, at least almost always correctly believe, have an impact on humans' experience of existing in societies. And so I wanted to start from the news because it seems like, and in many ways it is, and in a couple of different ways it's not, it seems like a theoretically neutral way to establish events, phenomena, things that are happening that might reasonably enough be seen to be important separately from their sociological component. So Joe Biden is elected president. He's going to cancel Keystone Pipeline. Some of us think that's good. Some people think it's bad. Almost everybody who thinks it's a good thing recognizes that there are some negative consequences to the canceling of the pipeline, and I'm almost certain. I'm just to be a little clearer, perhaps, than I've been. I'm glad they're going to cancel the pipeline. I'm on that side in my own personal capacity as a citizen. I'm on the side of. I've come to the conclusion that, on balance, the advantages outweigh the disadvantages of canceling that pipeline. But it's crystal clear to me that it's not reducible to a all or nothing situation where only bad things would happen if the pipeline were built and only good things will happen if the pipeline isn't built. It's very clear, and I think that it's an important consideration that thousands of jobs aren't going to happen as a result of that. And on the other hand, I still I still agree with those people who land on the view that that negative outcome is outweighed by the other advantages. Now, the reason I wanted to show you this Venn diagram is that these different theories will be seen as we move forward when we begin to look at more concrete issues like social stratification, for example, which describes and is concerned with the social consequences of economic phenomena. When we come to take a look at issues like education, so in the next half of the course, we'll take a look at education as a topic of sociological consideration, and we'll see that a little bit like the pipeline question, issues around education almost never resolve, I think never, but at least almost never resolve into crystal clear all in or all out notions. To stay with the education, to move away for a second from the pipeline and the economy, in education right now, in Canada, university education, the cost of university education has gone up dramatically in your generation. When I was an undergraduate, when I started university at McGill in 1979, tuition for the whole year was $590, if I remember correctly. There were some other fees and all that, but tuition for a whole year to get 6 courses in the fall and 6 courses in the winter, it was about $600. The cost of university between 1980 and 2021 has gone up at a rate that is something like 25 times higher than the rate of inflation. At the same time, the percentage of the amount of money that the government contributes as a percentage of the overall operating budget of universities and colleges has gone down dramatically. Now, the operating costs have gone up. That eats up some of the increased cost to university. But what's really gone on is that government funding has not anywhere near kept up with the cost of delivering the service. The social decision that was taken in Canada and in other jurisdictions, that has not happened. In Germany, for example, they recently decided to go back to the existing German policy of about 10 years ago, and post-secondary education is by and large free in Germany. So, it's not free. It's not free anywhere. Government revenues pay for tuition to post-secondary institutions in Germany. So that doesn't mean that it's free. What it means is that it's tax revenue that pays for it rather than individuals paying for it. And there's these represent 2 different approaches to how a society is going to pay for post-secondary education. And that decision itself has some support and some opposition. And so we'll see that there are different ways of trying to understand that. What is it that education offers to a society? Who benefits from that within a society, and how are those benefits distributed? The main difference between functionalist theory and conflict theory is that functionalist theory argues that everything else remaining the same, societies tend to pick a distribution of risk and reward in a way that is conducive in the long run for the reproduction of that society. Functionalists characterize that long-term trend in a slightly different way. The way conflict theorists characterize it is that equilibrium that's reached, that is the key account of the functionalist approach, that equilibrium systematically always favors some groups over other groups in any given society, and that's an avoidable outcome. So functionalists argue, because we live in a world of finite resources, humans have no other option other than to distribute those finite resources according to some kind of gradient. And what societies have done, so functionalist theorists look backwards over the development, over the course of human history, and what they see when they look at that course is an increasingly effective and equitable distribution of the risk and rewards that attach to life in a human society. What conflict theorists see when they look at that same history is systematically that within given societies, the groups that are benefiting from the distribution of the risks and the rewards that are characteristic of those societies systematically produce and reproduce the systems that result in some groups having advantages over other groups. And that the conclusion that's drawn on the one hand, to understand a society, functionalists argue you need to understand under what conditions are these equilibriums being set, whereas conflict theorists claim that the primary requirement to understand how societies operate is to understand which groups are benefiting the most and what mechanisms have they put into place in order to maintain their advantage over all the other groups in a society. Now, both functionalists and conflict theorists recognize that, at least in the past, right up until, say, this afternoon, not sure about what the future is going to look like, functionalists and conflict theorists agree, but in the past, to a great degree, these distributions were not accomplished in a fully conscious way. And so when functionalists and conflict theorists look at past societies, they recognize that often the social forms that result in these unequal distributions were justified using all kinds of ideological frameworks that fail to fully describe the reality that they're working in. So to pick an ancient example rather than a more contemporary one, if we look back at, say, Roman society I'm going to be doing a lecture in Hum 200 soon, so I've been preparing that, and it's at the front of my mind right now. When we take a look at ancient Roman society, we see that there was a religion in Rome, there were religious behaviors in Rome, and that religious behavior contributed to preserving to some degree the stability of social structures in Rome, such that the senatorial class maintained its power privilege over the rest of Roman society. Functionalists will point out that that's one of the ways that Roman society was able to preserve its advantages against the external threats that they faced from the people who were not in the Roman Empire. That it's through a senatorial class whose privileges were reinforced by a shared commitment of the population to a religious understanding of reality that made it possible for the senatorial orders, the senatorial commands, to be followed by the population in its production function and the army in its military function. Absent that religious institution, the society would have collapsed. And eventually it did, Well, we'll see about that. But so functionalists point out that in order for societies to survive, they need to be able to maintain a certain kind of equilibrium, and that the destruction of the maintenance of that equilibrium is a necessary condition for societies to survive, and that there is no a priori perfect distribution that will guarantee the continued survival of societies forever into the future. Conflict theorists, by and large, are neutral about that claim about the possibility of some a priori balancing. On the other hand, conflict theorists argue that when you take a look at how the different groups maintain their advantages over other groups in society, what you always find is an imbalance in society and an unjustified distribution of those advantages and those risks. Okay, so I'm almost out of time. Before the clock strikes 1 o'clock, I want to make sure that those of you who have to leave here, that I'm going to post later today a brief, later today, or actually not now, it's more likely to be tomorrow, a brief video describing what it is I'm looking for in the group literature review assignment, and what the first steps you need to take and what the next steps you'll need to take are in order to complete that assignment that'll be due at the end of the semester. It's 12:59, so I'm afraid I didn't leave myself, as I had hoped to do, enough time to have a questions session that's open to everybody. I can stick around for a few minutes if anybody has questions, but I wanted to make sure that I got that last announcement before anybody who had made plans for 1 o'clock was still logged in. So, are there any questions? I'm going to turn the recording off now, and then, but I'm going to